happy to be here in Calgary and come see you all tonight. Next hour or so, I'm going to tell you a lot about special places like this. Just to kind of jump ahead, this is the Lindenmeyer site. So if you got on the highways and headed south and make a couple lefts and rights along the mountain front, the Rockies down, you're going to go right by this place. And so this is on a major travel corridor all the way down to Mexico that's been used for 13,000 years or so. One of the salient characteristics of a place like this, and I'll make an argument that it's commonly used by the earliest inhabitants of this continent, or First Nations, is that this is a place that you can see from and be seen at. So it has an incredible view shed. You can see several hundred kilometers away from the south of the mountain ranges to the south of the site. But if you were setting up a camp here and you want people to see you, they easily could find you at this place as well. So in terms of a geographic address, this is really kind of important for those reasons. And I'll talk about other sites like this in the coming minutes. So I have three things I want to cover tonight. It's a general talk, so I'll assume that you don't know much about these earliest people. So I'll give you some basics about this 12,500-year-old culture that we call Folsom. I'll talk about that site that we just talked about a second ago, the Lindenmeyer site, which is the largest known Folsom site that we know of in all of North America. There's nothing that even comes close in terms of its geographic size or the amount of tools that it has and the special features that are found at the site. And then I'll talk about some of my colleagues' work and some work that we're doing too on other sites in Colorado that have really changed our understanding of these earliest peoples. And I'll kind of talk about how the public and a lot of archaeologists have talked about these earliest peoples in the past and how it's really just a stereotype and just really underrepresents the reality of the situation, and how the sites I'm talking about kind of help perhaps change some of those perspectives. So let's start off with the basics. It was in 1908 in northern New Mexico at the Folsom type site that this story first starts. Here we had George McJunkin here in the upper left. He was the ranch manager on the Crowfoot Ranch, and after a pretty massive rainstorm, wild horse arroyo downcut. So it downcut and exposed animal bones deeply buried below the surface, 15 feet, so 5 meters below the surface. He knew they were significant. There was no stone tools with them, but he collected the bones and tried to get people interested. And it took several decades, but by the early 1920s, places like the Colorado Museum of Natural History, which at that time Denver was just a cow town, and it was really trying to fight with the Chicagos and the Bostons and the DCs of the world of being a premier kind of scientific facility. They were mounting expeditions throughout the American West to gather paleontological specimens as well as archaeological specimens to really build up their reputation. So they came here to excavate this site as a bison quarry, just to get what we're seeing as Pleistocene bison, these supersized bison from the late Pleistocene in age. And in doing so, in 1926, they found stone tools in association with those bison remains. And this is a real famous photo. There's Barnum Brown on the right, who will go on to be pretty significant for finding T-Rex and publicizing that for the American Museum of Natural History. Very quickly after these stone tools were found, the Colorado Museum of Natural History, which is just this little tiny organization, is pushed out of the scene, and sure enough, the American Museum of Natural History out in New York City arrives so that they can have their own expedition and gather specimens that to this day are in Central Park on Manhattan. So here we have blacksmith Carl Schwaheim showing Barnum Brown some of the things that are coming out of this stratified and sealed archaeological deposit, because this is very important that at the time, human antiquity in North America was argued to be very recent, really shallow, especially on the plains. Folsom was a big deal in the sense that because those bison bones were found in context, geological context, in a sealed context, and they were of those supersized bison, this is before radiocarbon dating is invented, that allowed people to make an argument that people had been here, indigenous people had been here for thousands of years. Now at that point in time, it wasn't quite sure. It was an argument, and this is a dirty secret in archaeology, whether or not these were actually indigenous people or not, First Nations peoples, or some other group of people that lived in North America. I'll get to that in just a second. But over several seasons, excavations were undertaken there, and what they found there was a bunch of bison skeletons. And I call this like going to the grocery store. It had a bunch of food remains, some stone tools, but they didn't find fire pits, they didn't find houses, they didn't find almost any other thing besides these projectile points. And there's some examples of these Folsom points. They have a groove going down the middle of them. We call them fluted points. They're not rare, but they're pretty uncommon because of their antiquity. We were able to go back there when I was in graduate school in the late 1990s and excavate a portion, shown there in red, kind of on the eastern edge of the site. And what we were trying to do was find perhaps some associated campsites or other kinds of activities, but we didn't find anything. We just found more of the bone bit. Well, this discovery at Folsom was kind of a big deal because it really, in science, really pushed back the data of people here in North America. Right? Indigenous people knew they'd been here for millennia, since time immemorial. The archaeologists were trying to push this date back through their own methods. Now, something significant happened in terms of both economically as well as ecologically right about the time of the Folsom discovery. And right at that turn in the late 20s to early 30s, we just had massive drought. Now this affected the southern Great Plains where I work a lot, kind of where Texas and Colorado come together. But it affected all the way up here into the prairie provinces as well. And we call it the dirty 30s. We also had the filthy 50s. We had these periodic droughts through time. But as these storms would come in, people like Uncle Bill Baker, who's somebody I've studied for a long time in my career, they'd go out and they would go into these fields that in some cases would deflate 10, 20, 30 feet below the surface. I mean, forming these bowls, and they would just scoop up all these artifacts. And it was amazing time because that discovery had just been made in New Mexico, and then all of a sudden, there's Folsom artifacts everywhere. And we go from just a couple of them being known and published in the late 20s. By 1935, Jack Cotter, who was a student, goes on to be a pretty famous archaeologist at the University of Denver at the time, he's already documented 500 of these specimens just from collectors, primarily in eastern Colorado and the Plains states. Articles are going to push this all the way up here into Saskatchewan and Alberta as well, as the things coming out of the dunes and blowouts at the time. So we go from having no knowledge to this absolute quantity of knowledge within half a decade. I mean, just like that. Now, it's not necessarily the best quality data, but certainly it was starting to tell us some things. We now know that there are thousands upon thousands of these Folsom locales spread throughout the plains. I'll talk about this in just a second, but most of them are tiny. Just one or two Folsom points. And so, like, what does that mean? Is that a limited amount of behavior? Is this, we call small sites or isolated finds? We'll talk about that in the coming minutes. We'll skip forward decades at a time. This is the Paleo-Indian database of the Americas that's run out of Dave Anderson and Shane Miller's lab. They try to quantify the distribution of things like fluted points here in North America. And this is kind of the general Folsom range as we know it today. I mean, it's kind of the core as well as the edges. So we have Folsom finds from here in Alberta to Wisconsin and Illinois to the east, so below the Great Lakes, northern Chihuahua of northern Mexico today, and then places like Utah and the Snake River Plain of Idaho. The dense concentrations of these are found, and this is kind of the epicenter, is really the Great Plains itself. But now that we see that these folks are also in the intermountain basins, and I'll talk about that today. These are in high altitude settings. We never even envisioned this at the Folsom discovery, as well as in the desert Southwest. So our inferences about these folks is that they are oftentimes hunting bison. Well, these are environments today that you'd never suspect bison to be very prevalent, at least in large quantities, especially the desert Southwest. So that gives us some clues about changing kinds of climate. We also have really started to figure out when these people lived in the past. This is a recent paper that I published with some co-authors. The red things at the bottom are Clovis sites. The ones at the top in blue are Folsom sites. And it's kind of a statistical technique where we're trying to figure out the exact ages of when these folks are on the ground. And we use bone dates from bison bone beds to try to come up with some of our cleanest dated sites. But at the bottom there, just south of here, is Wally's Beach in southern Alberta, one of our earliest dated, well-dated Clovis sites. And at the top, we have some Folsom sites like the Waugh site in Oklahoma. Now, what's interesting, Folsom exists for approximately 600 years. So in terms of, you think about the time of, say, the Canadian government, the US government, and we're talking 2 to 3 times as long. So folks are on the ground doing this behavior for a long time. It's not a short-lived kind of thing. What we didn't know, though, prior to this study, is that we thought that these folks like Folsom and Clovis, which are associated oftentimes with mammoth hunting, we thought they were separate in time, but what we're now starting to realize is that they actually overlap in time as well. So that you can imagine like a Venn diagram, the overlap between the red and the blue, showing that they're on the ground making archaeological sites at the same time, perhaps overlapping for about 200 years or so. So there's a lot of things happening during this time. Folsom's occurring during a geological time called the Younger Dryas, when the actual glaciers above town are actually coming back down. They're actually increasing in size. It's actually colder than the preceding period. And Clovis is occurring during a time where we're getting massive extinctions of a lot of Pleistocene fauna, like mammoths and camels and horses and other kinds of animals. So a really dynamic time. Now stereotypically, and I've kind of spent my whole career kind of battling this perception, is that Paleo peoples, and the older term that people use is Paleo-Indians. Now I oftentimes talk about Paleo-Indigenous peoples being high plains drifters. So this idea, this iconic, we have Clint Eastwood here, of people just moving from this bison killer bicycle, like the Folsom type site, and just drifting across the plains nomadically with really no reason other than just to chase the herds. And this is a reconstruction that's very common in the public. A lot of archaeologists talk about this as well. I certainly don't. But yeah, we have lots of paleo bone beds for Folsom. Our largest ones are in Texas. We have a bone bed called Lipscomb with 55 bison. These are not insignificant for early peoples. They're obviously smaller than, say, our bison jumps in pounds around here, which are much later in time. But these are pretty big. And they actually increase in the next several thousand years. And oftentimes these sites contain exotic raw materials that might be hundreds of kilometers away from their source areas. So the idea is that these people must have moved from source to source as part of this drifting kind of thing. Well, a good quote from Clint Eastwood is, well, let's not go and ruin it by thinking too much about this premise, right? So that's what I want to kind of push up against this premise, to show that there was a lot more going on in this early period than just this drifting across the plains kind of reconstruction. So let's talk about Lindenmeyer. Now this is ironic. Here it is in northern Colorado, because it's the next Folsom site excavated in 1935 after the type site. So you couldn't come up with a bigger contrast. Here we have a grocery store, a food situation where people are hunting bison, and that's kind of all that's there, just tools, to what I'm about to show you, which is the polar opposite. Well, which one is representative of this past culture? Which one are you going to use to reconstruct the past? Well, it's a mix of both. But archaeologists consciously choose things to emphasize versus other kinds of things, and Lindenmeyer, ironically, is completely different, as we'll talk about in the coming minutes. Another irony is it was actually discovered before the Folsom type site in terms of the first artifacts. They just hadn't necessarily attracted scientists to work at the site, but these two brothers, Roy and Claude Coffin, found the site in 1924, and here's their initial finds at the site. Again, massive numbers of these fluted points. These are the first finds that they made here, but they found more than fluted points. So you're already getting, just from the surface hunters, and they were diggers too, a much different assemblage than was found at that site in New Mexico. Now, at that time, remember, we go from just a couple things known in New Mexico to well over 500 by the mid-1930s, so finding Folsom points wasn't a problem at that time. But finding things in good context, a good association was. And so the Coffins eventually were able to ask the Smithsonian Institution to come out and do some work at the site. And so right here, Frank Roberts, who's one of the lead archaeologists at the Smithsonian, came out there in 1934. And he was looking out for a specific kind of archaeological site to help resolve some of these issues. Now remember, I told you, at the time when people discovered the type site in Mexico, there was debate, and today we just think this is laughable, but it's just, it's just a sign of the times, as to who created that site. Was it indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, peoples of North America, or was it migrants from other kinds of places, right? This was commonly debated at the time, and people like Alistair Lischka, a famous physical anthropologist, said if you have sites of that antiquity, they must have Neanderthal-like traits. They should have physical features that allow them to show that they're much more deep in age in terms of antiquity, right? Taking a European model to this. So why did the Smithsonian go to Lindenmayer? Well, these are the headline newspapers of the time from the Denver Post and other papers. They were looking for someone who had died there. They want to find human remains associated with these first peoples. So much so that in the mid-30s, people were finding skeletons buried beneath 15 feet of sediment, and in some cases are naming them new species, Homo novus mundus being one example, and these are clearly Homo sapiens, and they're clearly indigenous peoples, like First Nations peoples. So this was the premise to get the Smithsonian out there, because they figured if you found a campsite where people lived for long periods of time, there's a better chance of someone living and dying and being buried nearby in those kind of contexts than say a grocery store, right? Nobody dies in a grocery store necessarily, but if you're staying in a settlement for a long time. So that attracted the Smithsonian to this place. This is what Lindenmayer looks like. It's a pretty spectacular site perched on the edge of the Rockies. It's just below the highest peaks in Colorado, which go 14,000 feet, so pretty high in elevation. Here we have a series of an older terrace that now has been downcut through erosion. You can see in there, here's the arroyo itself, and there's buried paleosols in here that are buried 5 to 7 meters deep. We've radiocarbon dated these soils. And what's amazing is those soils can be traced with artifacts well over 800 meters in size, in terms of length. So in terms of a buried surface that's in really great preservation, it doesn't get any better than this in terms of having that much lateral exposure of buried Pleistocene archaeology. You'll see us waving here as we come closer to where we were working in this particular portion of the site. This is some drone footage we flew a couple years ago. Now, as I mentioned, this place, I think, has some special characteristics. I mean, the archaeological record is spectacular enough, but then you think backwards like as to what would be the attractant to this place. And obviously, they were bison hunters, but the viewshed is spectacular. These are the red cliffs above the site that you can see well to the south. I mean, you can, on a clear day, we just looked from town. I live about 45 minutes south of town, and you can see this perched along the skyline. It is the state line between Wyoming and Colorado, which was really built on an ecological break. Wyoming is very windy, and as you come down into Colorado, it certainly is a little more temperate than, say, places like Laramie and Cheyenne, Wyoming. We think this location, this geographic location, was really important to the use of this place through time. Now, I showed you this image earlier, and that picture in the middle is the core range of Folsom. And what's amazing is if we split that in half, north-south and east-west, it essentially forms the modern-day interstate system of Interstate 25 and Interstate 80, which is also the Transcontinental Railroad that was built in the 1860s across the United States, which essentially decimated the northern and southern bison herds when that was built in the 1860s. This is a very specific place on the edge of the Rockies and at the only navigable spot east to west across the Rockies. This is where the Oregon Trail and every trail system in the United States goes through this area. And Lindenmayer is found within a couple miles or kilometers off this pathway. Is that coincidence that the largest Folsom site shares these characteristics? Is it coincident that when we look at raw material maps of the use of Folsom raw materials in all these sites throughout the plains, the one site that connects northern raw material sources and southern raw material sources is Lindenmayer, because we see peoples coming from all directions to come and use the Lindenmayer site through time. The Smithsonian did a lot of work there in the 1930s. This is showing you across about 800 meters or so in space. If you read the books about the site, it's all that stuff over there to the left. That's the stuff that's well published, and you hear a lot about it. What they found were spectacular kinds of things. This is pedestal bison bones, as well as smaller game, antelope as well as deer, as well as stone tools, buried within this paleosol, which is a really nice marker across the site. The Smithsonian, even though Frank Roberts was trained as a southwestern archaeologist, actually plotted out piece plotted all these artifacts and drew them on these maps in 3 dimensions, which we've been able to reconstruct from these records from the 1930s, which is amazing. And the site contains all sorts of Folsom technology. These are what we call preforms, so these are Folsom points being broken during their manufacture. This would occur after a hunt or in anticipation before a hunt, but not the kinds of things that you ever find in a bison bone bed. You'll be surprised when I show you how many came off the site in just a second. We have a variety of Folsom points that show different levels of resharpening. So they've been used and reused and repurposed through time. So they're going from big things to little things. And we know through experiments that those things could, if you're fortuitous in how they hit the carcasses, could perhaps be resharpened 4, 5, 6 times before you finally discard it if it didn't break catastrophically in each use. And this is the bread and butter of people like me. You write all boring papers about all these points and preforms because they're very diagnostic at time. But what sets Lindenmeyer apart is that it has the best evidence of jewelry in North America of the Pleistocene times of any site. And ironically, this is the second Folsom site excavated. So we have beads made of lignite as well as ochre, discs that I'll show you in just a second. My favorite set of tools from the site are these ones up here at the top. Here we have a broken hematite bead. It's about the size of one of those little donuts you buy at the gas station. And it's been drilled out from both sides and incised and carved into the middle. And I was working with one of my students at the museum doing collections research. And we saw that, and then in another drawer, it's like, there's a drill over in another drawer. And we pulled the drill, we'll get it out of that drawer. The drill was in the cracks of the drill, even though that had been handled many times since the 1930s in a wash, and there was a fire at the Denver Museum, etc. All the cracks on that drill still had red ochre in the cracks, just as if it had just been pulled out. You know, when you're woodworking, you have the dust from sawdust on your tools. All that ochre was still in the cracks, even though it had been cleaned and handled so many times. Hey, why don't you see if they refit? And we'll never be able to prove that this was used to drill that particular bead, although it came from an adjacent excavation unit. There's Aaron putting that drill into that bead, and it was like a key into a lock. It fit perfectly. And in the sense of the importance of that artifact, forget all those weapons of killing bison and all that kind of stuff. If these are High Plains Clint Eastwood drifters out there, I don't see Clint wearing a bunch of jewelry. And what's amazing about this site is until recently, this site, more than any site, Pleistocene site in North America, had the most bone needles of any known site of this antiquity. Over 20 known from this particular site. Now these were recovered in the 1930s when excavation techniques were much more coarse than we do today. So you can only imagine why we're excited to work at a place like Lindenmeyer. But then things like this, discs made out of steatite as well as bone. We never see these in sites of this antiquity here in North America. They look like gaming pieces that come out of later records. We have really good ethnography of gaming traditions. This is kind of this binary type system of flipping chips over. They're marked on one side and not the other side. And not to say that they're related, but Magdalenian sites of the same age in France, living during that really cold pulse at the end of the Pleistocene, are filled with those kinds of what we think are gaming pieces coming off habitation sites. So which one of these is a better reconstruction of those past peoples, right, of Folsom peoples? Now let's combine that with the quantity of stuff. If we add up all the collections that have come from there, these are just some of the numbers, over 600 projectile points just from this site alone. Now that's crazy when you consider that most Folsom sites are 1 to 2 projectile points. And I'll spend 6 months of my life writing an article that has 15 Folsom points. And you know, that's a big deal that I spend a chunk of my year writing an article on something like that. There's nothing that gets even close to this quantity of stuff. So what does that represent? Well, what makes the site special is not because it's old. Now we know, we've shown that there's plenty of sites of this antiquity, but it's the sheer quantity of materials and the fact that this is not found on a it's not found on a raw material source. There are local rocks there, but most of these rocks are coming in from fairly distant sources, most of them, the majority from southeastern Wyoming. Again, the geological context is important as well. What makes the site special, and these are some reconstructions of an artist that I did to help kind of visualize all these different pieces, is that when you look across the site, there's all these clusters of debris that were found through excavations as well as our work out there. We have bison kills, we have areas of hide working, we have areas of sowing, we have areas of projectile point manufacture and discard. And the challenge of this site is, well, what does that represent? Does it represent some giant communal place that people one time came and occupied as one giant festival, one giant gathering, one giant kind of get together? Or does it represent a place that was occupied 20 times? Or is it some mix in between? Well, regardless, you know, what I like to say, well, it's complicated. It's one of those scenarios there. But the point being is, this is not the Folsom type site. This is a very, very different story, right? And one that's underplayed by archaeologists. And most archaeologists, oh, Lindenmayer is pretty interesting, but it's so complex they didn't even want to touch it because it just had so many pieces to it. We don't have many buried sites over 800 meters of this antiquity on the plains. So moving to the second piece, what does the eastern locality represent? This comes from some published work that I can send you if you're curious about trying to understand this easternmost portion of the site. And only about 500 words were ever published on this portion of the site. So that's been the focus of our work over the last couple of years for sure. We weren't the first people to know about this. The Coffin family, who I said discovered the site, they had their own collection locales there, and here are those same locales there on the eastern side. And here are some then and nows to kind of show you what this area looks like. This is from 1934 when Frank Roberts first showed up. And this is the spot of those initial discoveries. And what the coffins were finding there was, remember all those fluted points? Pretty cool. They found them in a big pile, but they also found all sorts of other kinds of tools. Lots of hide working implements that are called end scrapers there. So it's a classic kind of hide processing area. Different areas of the site also have some end scrapers embedded with red ochre in them, some of them with no red ochre whatsoever. Our hypothesis is that we're looking at wet and dry hide kinds of working in those kinds of scenarios. In this case, some dry hide working areas. Here's an area of the coffins. Because this area is relatively shallow, we're closer to the surface because of the geology of the site. Frank Roberts let them have this area as an area for them to do their near surface digging in. So he kind of left it alone because he was really interested in those stratified deposits. Like I said, 5 meters below the surface. Now this area of end scrapers, interestingly enough, about less than 100 meters away was a pile of bone that was being brought up by gophers and other things to the surface. We call this a whack-a-mole kind of slide here, you know, the little carnival game where you knock those diggers down below the ground. But the gophers would bring bone up to the surface. So we knew the bone in this area, it's not abundant there, but it's showing up, you know, after rains as well as after the winters, you know, when animals are kind of digging tunnels below the surface. So that led the Smithsonian to do work in this area in the 1930s, a little bit of work. This is the area that the coffins first found in 1924. We showed the pictures of them kind of digging those rat holes. But this is the area called the Bison Pit, which had about 12 bison in it, excavated by the Smithsonian in their initial years there. It also has some Pleistocene camel in it too, which is interesting now that we know that Folsom and Clovis overlap in time. There might have been some straggler camels on that surface at that time, or it could have been a dead animal that drifted down in that arroyo as bits and pieces. The Denver Museum also did some work out there in the 1930s. We're able to georeference all these past pits because Frank Roberts left all his datums in place. We were able to relocate them and then georeference them with all our mapping. So we can overlay all the previous maps with anything that we find out there today. So as I'll show you in the coming minutes, when we did excavations out there, we can literally go within a foot of where they dug in the 1930s and pick up right off where they left off. So that's been our goal over the last 15 years or so, is doing a lot of kind of management work at the property. It's owned by the city of Fort Collins. You can go visit this. It's closed right now as a winter reserve for animals, but it will be back open in the spring. And over the years, when you go, I take students out there, or the public, we did lots of tours out there, and at any one time you might find 3 or 4 flakes and 10 or 15 pieces of bone. And I know people give me crap about piece plotting in terms of why do you bother meticulously mapping things? Well, the thing is, you talk to indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, and they'll tell you that archaeological sites are alive. And a lot of people from your American perspectives are like, oh, well, yeah, I don't understand what that means. Well, here's a good example of how an archaeological site is alive, is that with every time the wind blows, every time it rains, every time the gophers come, it changes that archaeological site and things are exposed. And what this represents, we've done there, is this composite plot that if you go out there, there is no spatial patterning of any artifacts that you'd ever find on the site surface. But over time, we have a composite image of these things. And this is one of the things, especially for student training, we go out for an afternoon, map some things, come back and do it again and again and again, because we have the time to do these kinds of things. Archaeological sites are alive. They change on a daily basis. One of the tough things of being an archaeologist, oftentimes we get a chance to evaluate a site once or twice, but it could change dramatically within a short period. So that's a really important take-home pattern. So over time, there's definite spatial patterns. We have lots of bone and burned bone coming on the surface, especially in the area to the left there, which is where we know there's a known bison kill with at least 12 bison. To the right, we have a mix of bison bone as well as lithics. If you look to the north, there's almost no artifacts there. Well, this is an area the Smithsonian never messed with, because what happens is, geologically, all the artifacts in bison bone go below the surface, because we're looking at a cross-section of an old valley, and like a coal seam, the artifacts are exposed in portions of the site at the surface. And as we work our way into that old valley, they go 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters below the surface, and that valley is filled with sediment over the last 13,000 years ago. For this very reason, when we did a management plan for this site, no trails, no hikers, nobody goes to this portion of the site because they can see artifacts on the surface. We've steered them to areas where the artifacts are buried deep below the surface. Patterns to that. Larger bones, no surprise, but thankfully to us, larger bones over by the bone bed, smaller bones over near what we can interpret as a processing area. The reverse in terms of all the burnings over what we suspect is a campsite. And over that period, we documented all sorts of tools. Again, broken projectile points, burned preforms, which are not burned in prairie fires. These are probably coming out of hearths that have now decomposed, call them phantom hearths, because the charcoal is now gone. And then lots and lots and lots of those end scraper tools. So we're getting to this. We're building a hypothesis here. What we think this portion of Lindenmeyer is, and remember I'm telling you, Lindenmeyer is a really complicated story. It's got everything. When we think there's houses there, we think there's habitations. In this particular portion of the site, though, this really fits what we call the ABC model of Folsom mobility, derived from a couple sites in Wyoming and Colorado. But this is an idea that when people make a bison kill and it's of sufficient size, the whole band moves to that locale and sets up a camp adjacent to that bison kill. And within logical distance, they're not going to camp a half mile away, a mile, or 800 meters away, or a kilometer away. They're going to camp a sufficient distance, for the smell and the bugs and all that kind of stuff and the carnivores, but still close enough that they can process that bone bed to get everything they want for storage to move on at a later period of time. So our estimate is that this site represents one of these, what we call a kill and a camp. And spatially, if we start looking at excavated sites, there's a really neat pattern to this. And we can look at this from the ethnographic record, as well as with living peoples around the world throughout the 20th century. There's spatial patterns as to how this lays out. Here we have Lindenmeyer on the top, and a famous site called Stewart's Cattle Guard in southern Colorado on the right, excavated by the Smithsonian. In both areas, we have a kill area where there's a bison kill. At Cattle Guard, this is really well documented and published. We have a series of hide working camps and tool refurbishment camps. And so this really led to a model that led to this field school that we had at Lindenmeyer right during COVID in 2021 to test some of these ideas. So I'll walk you through this in the coming minutes. So here's some of our crew from 2021, field school from CSU. So if you've never been in an archaeological dig before, we do a lot of mapping. So here we are using a total station to map in our artifacts and our excavation units. This was very meant to be a kind of not a data recovery, but a testing project. So we're digging a whole bunch of shovel test pits and one by one spread across particular portions of the site to test some of these ideas and trying to get as deep as possible. So going down, in some cases, 1.5 meters below the surface in some of these pits, typical kinds of profiling for stratigraphy, those kinds of things. And here's the rationale for what we're trying to do there. You can see the old excavation units, and all those little black dots with white circles represent different kinds of testing things where we are circumscribing all these different portions of the site to test this hypothesis that this is a kill camp. And the way it works out is that here we have on the left that bison bone bed, the processing camp where the animals were killed and dispatched and were beginning to be processed. There's going to be a little bit of hearths working in there. We know that there's some associated campsites in the middle. We have burned preforms, some other bison bones that are coming from gophers and test pits in this middle portion of the site. And like I said, less than about 75 to 80 meters away, in some cases a little bit more, we have this area that we think is a hide working tool replacement, a general kind of Folsom camp. So here's what that work looked like in 2021. Here's a shot from 1936 of excavating the bison pit. All those are bison bones there in the bison kill at the bottom. You can see they're really in association with that Paleosol, just below that Paleosol, that we've dated to late Pleistocene in age. I want you to look at that hill there in the background in the next couple of photos. We think this is an area where they are disarticulating those bison, so they're breaking them into pieces and starting the processing. The Smithsonian certainly recognized that some of this bone was burned, so this is probably not prairie fires, but through processing for food procurement and cooking. But we definitely know there's killing of the bison, culling of the bison in this area, because in some cases, I mean, we have projectile points laying in the neural the neural arch of, say, of vertebrae. You can see this particular gentleman, it's not very deep in this particular portion, although it gets deeper as we go to the north. Here's that same shot in 2021. I was always curious about this little scarp that you see there in front of, this is Dr. John Seebach, a colleague of mine. We would have tools and flakes and bone eroding out of that, obviously clay-enriched little hang-up right there. And this is exactly where that bone bed happened to be, the edge of it, in the 1930s. So we started excavating on the side of that bison pit, and with our first units, start hitting bison. So just like that Folsom type site in New Mexico, now this is pretty broken because we're pretty close to the surface, it's pretty fragmentary. We have a couple of phalanges exposed there. Here's a molar to show you. But like that Folsom type site in New Mexico, we're digging right on the edge of that bone bed, right? So we definitely, in our testing, now this was not data recovery, we're not trying to remove the entirety of the bone bed because, frankly, we don't give them permission by the city government to do so. But we definitely show that the bone bed is still there. So we have portions of that still intact. So that was pretty significant in that portion of the site. A little bit further to the east, this is the area that we think is the hide working area. We know it was disturbed by the coffins, and we were able to confirm that we had found historic artifacts as well as kind of the churning that they had done on portions of this site. But we're really curious whether or not there was any Folsom artifacts on that south side. Now, south of this, at the bottom of the page, it's completely gone. It's eroded away. But here we have a seam, like a coal seam exposed on that surface. Is that intact or not? So what we were able to do with putting in profile sections right there, we see it diving into the surface and going down below the surface, which is exactly what we wanted. The Smithsonian, as well as the coffins, went to the easiest to find stuff that was only very shallowly buried. But as we go to the north, where it gets more expensive today because it's time and labor, things are deeply buried. Same thing goes here on these areas that had never been tested in the previous years. Every unit we put in there had tools in it. So, and they're mostly end scrapers. So again, this is that area where we saw those folks digging in the 1930s. Here's that excavation in 2021, and fortunate enough to find Folsom tools coming out of those deposits. So here's the broken base of a Folsom point, heavy carbonates on it. This is exactly what you want to find in a camp type situation where people are dehafting or removing projectile points from their spears, making new ones and putting them back on. Now I'm going to show you other sites why this is significant in just a second, but this is exactly the kind of behavior you expect when people have households and are staying in places for long periods. Not drifters, but residence in an area where you start to see tons of things like bases. Now, as an archaeologist, of course I love the stone tools and the bison bone, but what's most important on this site is tracing those old paleosols to help us understand where the site's intact, just to show you that kind of, I call it a down periscope of kind of like a submarine. Here we have on the surface that paleosol is exposed, and this actually gives a little knob surface that you could walk along and see things eroding out if you know how to walk the surface there. That paleosol is exposed there, it comes right out on the surface. You won't find artifacts on either side of it, just at that seam. And you can see it's got a tilt to it. The lights are a little kind of washing out a little bit. But as we move to the north, that paleosol, you can't really see it at all, but trust me, there's a dark paleosol there at the bottom of this layer. And within a few short meters going to the north, now we're 1.5 meters below the surface. And as we cord and auger to the further beyond that, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So the Smithsonian dug on one side of the site because they were really excited that it was so deeply buried, but they never got into the really hard to get to areas. They were working into the sides of arroyos because that was easy to access those things. What we're showing through the work here is there is plenty of archaeology in this particular portion of the site, but let alone the rest of the site, that is still intact. So if they found needles and jewelry and discs and things using their techniques in the 1930s, as good as they were, goodness knows what's still remaining at this site. So we did find interesting artifacts in terms of a variety of scrapers and bifaces and preforms and gravers, things that are typical of sites of this antiquity. But more importantly, we start to come up with some basic patterns. And again, these are hypotheses to this book because it's a testing procedure. But when we look at burned bone, which is orange, and unburned bone, which is blue, we can see in the area that we think is like a kill processing area, almost all that bone's unburned, which is what you'd suspect. The animals are dying there and they're being processed. As we move to the little bit to the south, we start picking up some burn material on the edge of those bone beds, which is not uncommon comparing to other bone beds that we've known through excavations throughout the plains. But as we go over to the campsite, it's the reverse. All the bone is burned, right? Which is exactly what you expect to see in a residential. This is where the hearths are. This is where the food and the cooking and the hanging out and stories and all those great things are happening over there. That pattern's out very well. Same thing goes with the spatial distribution of lithics, limited lithics over in the bone beds, which is very common. You're just culling those bison. You might have resharpening flakes from processing them, but most of our tools are associated over here with our camp activity. So this 2021 work was really, the purpose of that was to test this kill camp type model, and nothing that we did refutes that model. So at least in this portion of Lindenmeyer, this is a good example of a kill in a camp that was occupied for some time. Now what we need to do though is test for contemporaneity. We can do this with refitting artifacts or dates to tie together those areas to make sure that they're used simultaneously. But what we started to do is to date different portions of that site across 800 meters to see how they relate to one another. Does this represent, remember Folsom spans 600 years, it could very well be that it was used over 600 years and you have all these different occupations, or was it used over several generations that people came back to every couple of years with them and their families? Because remember, it's a known address. It's at a very specific place, right? This is a very, very different story that I want to tell you than what most people talk about with these ancient paleocultures of the Plains and Rockies. Now I want to end by giving you a hint at some work that my colleagues are doing that are similar to this at other sites in the Colorado Rockies that really strengthen some of these ideas that I'm suggesting you tonight. And I'm also shopping the books for them too. So all these books that I've been showing you, you can get on Amazon or wherever you want. This is the Mountaineer site, which is located in Gunnison. This is in the mountains of Colorado. This was excavated by Western State Colorado University and SMU in the late 1990s to late 2000s. Of course, after I left SMU, they started working here. This is the Mountaineer site. We call it W Mountain because it has a W on the side for the college that was there. You'd think the occupation would be at the bottom of the hill. It's at the top of that hill, where there's no water on top except for snow. But Gunnison is one of the coldest places in Colorado. And I mean, you should know it around here. This is a great example of temperature inversion. In the midst of the winter, the higher you go, the warmer it is. And so like, where you're here at the airport, that is a cold, cold sink at the bottom. And so here we have Folsom folks during that really cold period camping on top of this mesa. Now, like Lindenmeyer, it's see and be seen. The view shed from the top there is amazing. So we know they're hunting bison. We have bison bone from the site. So imagine these bison, their hides, they're not like snowshoe hares. They're not turning white in the wintertime. So imagine any bison in that cold, cold Gunnison snow, what they'd look like. And I always think of call them like, they look like raisins in white yogurt, right? Just like you could see them so easily, and how important that view shed would be to people, to hunters, using this as an overlook. Now, Mark Steiger, who's at Western State College, or State University now, is kind of an obsessive person, and so he would take his students up there and they would literally crawl this mesa top. Now, when this site was first recorded, it was recorded as not significant. They were putting antennas up for at that point for telephones. And so it was, oh, it's just a surface scatter. It's insignificant. There's nothing up there. So he'd take his students, it's 15 minutes from campus, and they'd sit up there and they would just crawl and crawl and crawl the top of this mesa. And over time, this is just a small little piece. It is nothing but dot or cluster after cluster of artifacts across this mesa top. The ones in boxes are major Folsom occupations that have been excavated in the last 15 years by these research partners. Here's Mark in Block A, very shallow. Most people would walk away from a site like this because, unlike Lindenmeyer, it's less than 10 centimeters below the surface. But what he found there are things like daub, concentrations of daub that are spatially clustered in areas about 4 to 6 meters across. And he just spent a sabbatical in his lab refitting the daub, putting the daub pieces back together. And what do you think he found in the daub? When he put it up together like this, there was actually pole impressions within the daub that were the wooden superstructure that was once in place. That rotted away. The daub preserved just like brick, and as it collapsed, there it collapsed in place, leaving the impressions not only of the size of this former structure, but also the superstructure that was in place to hold up those insulating walls. Associated with this, these are just some, again, typical kinds of things. Unlike the Lindenmeyer site, almost all this weaponry is made of local raw materials, completely contrary to what we see. And in the Colorado mountains, there are so many raw material sources that the rocks aren't traveling great distances. They're there being used in a region or locally. Another block. You take any archaeologists out here, especially a southwestern archaeologist, you start talking about houses and pit houses, they laughed when these were first being excavated. How could you ever see a house here? What the team started doing was painting the rocks of certain sizes, did statistical models of the spatial orientation of some of these rocks, dug excavation blocks in areas with no artifacts to compare that background signature to the archaeological signatures, looked at the spatial distribution of all those piece plotted stuff, etc. And the largest rocks started forming these circles with entryways, like type tunnel type things that look like they're commonly found in type Arctic houses. But then all the artifacts are found within these structures, or presumed and inferred structures, as well as underneath some of the rocks that had fallen in when the structures had collapsed. Right? Not something we'd suspect whatsoever. What makes Mountaineer so important, and this ties it back to Lindenmeyer, is it shows that these residential bases are places that people live for significant periods. I mean, they're staying there, in this case, probably for the entire winter. In multiple inferred houses, you have fluted projectile points, fluted Folsom points, where they're removing the channel flake, which is the flake that forms that groove. That's left within the structure. The Folsom point is taken, probably hafted. We didn't see a picture of that. Presumably it's hafted. It's used somewhere. Now, it could have been 5 feet away, but the point was never, the rest was never found. Probably off in the distance. They're going out on their forays, hunting animals. It breaks. Well, what do? They bring their equipment back to their house. They're sitting in that cold weather house, they got a hearth in the middle of it. They're heating up the hafting, they're unwrapping that projectile point, they're discarding it in the house. So we have the life cycle of a projectile point being made, being taken away off site somewhere, and again, it could be 5 meters to 500 kilometers away, but coming back to that same place and discarding within that household. It's absolutely amazing considering this is 13,000, well, 12,500 years ago. The fine screening here, this is all water mesh screening. The preservation is not very good given the deposition, but they actually found fetal bison bone. Radiocarbon dated the bone. It's Folsom in age, so this is not subsequent occupations. So we have bison being hunted as well as fetal bison accumulating in these assemblages during the winter time when they're living on top of this temperature inverted mesa in the mountains of Colorado. And spectacular things like refits. Refits are our most powerful way of getting a contemporaneity. You can see in this case different colors of rocks that you initially would never fit together because you would think that they are different raw material. Obviously one's been burned, and that's why we have the color change. But the refits and conjoins allow you to talk about contemporaneity, that those things were once connected together. And what's amazing is typically with refits, they're usually between me and you in the audience, 3 to 5 meters is a typical refit, which is, no duh, that's a very short distance. When you start getting refits of large distances, for example, at the Murray Springs Clovis site, we have them of tens of meters between the kill and the camp, just as we saw the tip of the projectile point here, the base of the projectile point back in the camp, refit them together. At Lindenmeyer, we have one that refits 120 meters, again, connecting those places together. So when you get refits within an area, that's one thing, that's cool. But when you get refits between clusters, that's significant because either it represents that people are moving from house to house, just as you do when you go camping with people and you got lodges there and you're sharing food and you're sharing traditions and you're going to somebody else's house. So you're moving those things between those houses, or perhaps it could be scavenging, that people are picking up items later and moving them to new clusters. I mean, it could be a couple different things, but it is connecting those pieces together. Again, this isn't 500-year-old sites, this is 12,500, which is amazing. And then finally, again, we had all these Folsom projects occurring simultaneously by different research groups, but doing similar things. This is the Barger Gulch site, again, up in the Colorado Mountains. This is an intermountain basin. Todd Serval just published this wonderful book. You should have him up for a talk on the Barger Gulch site. Here it's sitting on a raw material source. Here's the excavation area, but here's the raw material source itself at Barger Gulch, which is a tributary of the Colorado River. But within this arroyo system, there's 11 different Paleo-Indian sites within just this arroyo system that are washing out of these arroyos. And within each of those, there's multiple clusters. And so it's like a landscape of these ancient sites concentrated around this raw material source. This isn't High Plains drifters. This isn't Clint Eastwood. This is residences here. Meticulous work by the University of Wyoming and good colleagues of mine. We share research and ideas all the time. Here they open up several different clusters there, found lots and lots of material. This is one of our oldest Folsom sites that actually overlaps with Clovis sites in age. Again, the kinds of things we suspect to see, those broken projectile point bases, which are commonly found at residential sites. We have preforms for making kinds of things. Todd's job was to make sense of all that mess of plotted artifacts there. And what he was able to do is to look at where burned artifacts were. There was no charcoal to denote where a hearth was. But he plotted out the locations of burned artifacts, and there was a spatial positioning where those artifacts happened to be. He then looked at the densities of artifacts and their orientation from being scattered, using compasses and things, and was able to plot out not only the location of phantom hearths that are no longer there, but in 3 different areas what are proposed to be the walls of structures. Same sizes and shapes as to those found at that Mountaineer site, again another high altitude site in the mountains of Colorado. He's got kickouts, so if you can imagine this, it's cold as heck. They're opening the door and there's scatters of fan feather, like think of feathers of the tails of a bird, right? Of that scatter outside the doorway, of things being thrown outside the doorway. gaps where things are not going beyond the walls of the structure because there's walls. They can't go beyond the walls of that structure. So a reconstructed artistic reconstruction of Bar Gulch in the wintertime, I think Lindemeyer's the same thing. I think at least parts of it are a winter habitation site. The kill camp, as I talked about, is one aspect of that. But the things to the west, I think, represent a lot of these kinds of behaviors. So I've talked enough, but I just wanted to kind of wrap things up to talk about what we've learned about Folsoms from where we started to where we are now. I had to give in a plug for another Folsom site we're working on. This is my graduate student, Kelton Meyer's PhD project. This massive Folsom site called Redden that's well over 84 hectares in size. Another one of these massive clusters upon clusters of sites. Archaeologists in general are pretty dumb people. We're very simple people. And we like things that are very easy. So we like sequences that have 3s or 5s in it because we can't get beyond early, middle, late. Because if you get early, early, middle, and middle, middle, late, it gets really confusing. So we like simple things. And while that's useful for communicating to people about ideas, it's such a detriment because it doesn't give credit to the complexity of the past. Especially in these hunter-gatherer type situations when the sites typically yield stone tools, if we're lucky, jewelry, bison bones, and spatial patterns. These sites are as complex as anything you could ever imagine. And there is hardly any one uniform Folsom behavior. There's no normative high plains drifters. If we look at bison bone from Folsom sites, every Folsom site that has bone, it's got bison bone in it. So undeniably they love bison, as do everyone that's ever lived on the plains. Bison is something people on the plains love, and the Rockies as well. But what else shaped their settlement systems and where they chose to live? I like to think that people knew these places intimately and knew where to go and knew where resources were and used them over and over and over again. And that's not what we oftentimes talk about with the earliest peoples, certainly later in time. But here we have the earliest peoples like Folsom folks repeatedly using these places over in time. The jewelry, the ochre, the needles, all those suggest, no surprise, sophisticated clothing and investment in high-quality gear. We should be talking more about that rather than just about their subsistence. When we look at places like the Intermontane Basin, which are, most people would say they're places that are hard to live in today because of the cold climates, they have mostly local raw materials in them. So rather than being just these one-off kinds of things, and rather than the plains perhaps being the epicenter of Folsom type of behavior, places like the Intermontane as well as the desert Southwest perhaps might have been the most attractive places for these past peoples to occupy. Again, we never would have thought this 100 years ago or 50 years ago. This is part of the story, but in the cold weather, we think that, based upon this research, that these are places where people were aggregating together, people were coming together. And what we're trying to now figure out is, when we talk about people coming together, was it kin that people were very close to that came together, aggregated on a seasonal basis at these winter residences? Or were there people that were more distant relations coming in and sharing information, ideas, and all sorts of other kinds of activities at those places? We don't know the relationships of those people. The last thing is, what's going on in places like Alberta and Indiana and northern Mexico, right? We have Folsom out there, and those oftentimes have exotic raw materials in them. Does that represent Folsom people's foraging out and moving out to those places, or are those places of interaction and movement of Folsom and other people from the Great Lakes and other places coming together in kind of this shared space? We haven't really thought about it in that sort of way, but it's really perplexing to us that after 100 years of doing Folsom archaeology, why we haven't found these kinds of sites outside that core area of Folsom. Is that just a coincidence, or is there something more to it in terms of how Folsom people use this larger landscape? So with that, I have lots of acknowledgments. Lots of people help with this work in terms of huge student teams over the years and a variety of other funding partners as well as other researchers. This project was funded by the National Park Service and the National Historic Landmarks Program, and especially the Jim and Audrey Benedict Fund for Mountain Archaeology. So I really thank you for coming out tonight and not going to the Avs and the Flames game next door. But I'd be happy to take any questions you have or any thoughts you might have on this topic. So again, thank you for your time tonight.